I'm Ann Thornton, Vice Provost and University Librarian at Columbia University Libraries, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight. In 2008, the Norman E. Alexander Foundation generously donated $4 million to Columbia University Libraries to hire a Jewish studies librarian and to support collections in Jewish studies. Thanks to the continued support of Gail Benderman and the Alexander Foundation, Columbia University Libraries has become internationally known for its Jewish studies collections. We participate in local and global partnerships in Jewish studies librarianship and are very proud of the work that we have done. As just a few examples, we were partners with New York University, the New York Public Library, Tel Aviv University, and the National Library of Israel in making important early newspapers from the American Jewish press freely available to the public. We have just completed initial digitization on a massive archive documenting Yiddish linguistics. And we are about to complete a project to catalog all of our rare Hebrew imprints in Clio, Columbia's online catalog. None of these projects, or the many other Jewish studies-related projects at the library, would have been possible without the Norman E. Alexander Foundation. The annual Norman E. Alexander Lecture celebrates the Alexander Foundation's great gift to us and demonstrates our commitment to supporting the field of Jewish studies at Columbia for many years to come. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Michelle Chesner, the Norman E. Alexander Librarian for Jewish Studies.
Thank you, Anne. Before I start, I'm just going to ask that everybody turn their cell phones off or silence them. Welcome. It was silence your cell phone. Jenna Weissman Joselit is the Charles E. Smith Professor of Jewish Studies and Professor of History at the George Washington University, where she also created and now directs 2 graduate programs in Jewish culture and the arts, the first of their kind in the country. Dr. Weissman Joselit is the author, among other things, of The Wonders of America, which received the National Jewish Book Award in History, and of the critically acclaimed A Perfect Fit: Clothes, Character, and the Promise of America. She also writes a monthly column for the Forward newspaper, which is just about to enter its 18th consecutive year of publication. Her latest book, Set in Stone: America's Embrace of the Ten Commandments, will be published in the spring. In addition to teaching and writing, Jenna Weissman Joselit has enjoyed an active career as a museum curator and consultant. Her most recent exhibition, Shalom Bayis: Reflections on the American Jewish Home, is on view at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst. A former senior fellow at Princeton's Center for the Study of American Religion, on whose academic advisory board she sits, Joselit has also been a fellow at Michigan's Frankel Institute, Penn Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, and Yale Center for American Art and Material Culture. Most recently, she has been a distinguished visiting scholar at the Library of Congress's John W. Kluge Center. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Jenna Weissman Joselit.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Ever since Moses came down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments in tow, these divine prescriptions have exercised the collective imagination. Everyone, historians, clergy, literary critics, novelists, psychotherapists, and politicians, everyone has had something to say about them. My bookshelves, and I imagine yours as well, sag under the weight of so much commentary, especially when, for good measure, you throw in the vast and steadily growing literature on the First Amendment and the nettlesome relationship between church and state. Much of this literature is well known, perhaps even familiar. But now and again, you happen across a text that occasions another look at the 10 Commandments, a deepening of perspective, a sharpening of critical engagement. This evening, I'd like to talk about 2 such publications, all with an eye towards understanding how it came to pass that the 10 Commandments captured and enlivened the American imagination. The first text I'd like to share with you is not much to look at. The whole thing, which dates to 1860, runs to no more than 13 pages. The paper on which it's printed is inexpensive, the typography rudimentary. When I consulted the text several years ago in the rare book room of the New York Public Library, the composition was so fragile and brittle that crumbs of paper littered the table every time I turned its pages. But then I have a sneaking suspicion that even in its prime, the condition of the text was not much better. The entire assemblage looks as if it's held together by spit and polish. Like its physical armature, the literary sensibility of this 1860 publication also leaves a lot to be desired. Opaque, dense, hard to follow, the composition sinks under the weight of detail and a torrent of words. The steadying hand of an editor is nowhere in evidence. Still, for all its shortcomings, this text from 1860 packs a wallop. Its loosely bound pages tell one hell of a story. The discovery of an ancient relic containing the text of the Ten Commandments. A discovery made not in the Holy Land or in ancient Egypt, but in Ohio. The volume is called A Representation of the Two Stones with the Characters Inscribed Upon Them that were found by D. Weyrich during the summer of 1860. Not a very inspiring title. Its author, D., or David Weyrich, was a retired surveyor of the county of Licking, Ohio. His neighbors thought him a simple-minded, earnest man of the people of ordinary capacity. Weyrich believed that the area's array of Indian earthworks, its monster stone mounds, was the handiwork of the 10 lost tribes. To back up his belief, Weyrich spent many of his waking hours excavating these 1,000-year-old Indian burial mounds. They were so plentiful in his part of the country that it came to be known as Ohio's very own Valley of the Kings. Weyrich's steadfastness paid off when in November 1860 his spade hit something hard, a small stone casket in which reposed a second lithic object said to be of peculiar shape and dark color. Measuring 6 7/8 inches long, 2 7/8 inches wide, and 1 5/8 inches thick, it reportedly bore a strong resemblance to a plain, round-topped church window. But everything else about the stone was unusual. One side contained an incised likeness of a turban and tunic-clad gentleman of decidedly oriental and truculent appearance, or so we are told. The figure sported a neatly trimmed beard and clutched an arch-shaped tablet to his breast. The other side of the stone was covered from top to bottom in what appeared to be, and was later confirmed, as Hebrew script. Running every which way and into one another, the letters came together to form the text of the Ten Commandments, a slightly abridged version to be sure, and one riddled with spelling mistakes to boot, but an unmistakable version of the storied text all the same. News of Weyrich's discovery spread quickly, electrifying the imagination and generating considerable excitement. If this is authentic, declared the Cincinnati Daily Inquirer, it ranks among the most important discoveries of the kind ever made upon this continent. Added Reverend M.R. Miller of Senecaville, Ohio, Weyrich's find, soon to be known far and wide as the Decalogue or Holy Stone, furnished incontestable proof, said he, that the sons of Jacob were walking on the soil of Ohio many centuries before the birth of Columbus. Here, Miller said, here are Hebrew letters and words and sentences and law brought out from the depths of these mounds. These letters are not Syriac or Arabic, Egyptian or Chinese. They are Hebrew, and Hebrews must have placed them where we find them. In short order, the Decalogue stone was photographed, sketched, traced, and cast in plaster so that its likeness could be widely circulated, studied, and even made available for autopsy, as one interested party would have it. What's more, in a rather startling departure from current scholarly protocol, Weyrich agreed to part company with his precious find long enough for the learned men of the American Ethnological Society to see for themselves what all the fuss was about. Handling this object, turning it this way and that, the organization's members trained their sights on the script, whose lettering did not resemble any Hebrew characters they had previously encountered. With its unfamiliarly shaped aleph, lamed, and ayin, what kind of Hebrew could this possibly be, they asked themselves, avidly discussing the finer points of epigraphy. Well, I know my alephs, said one scholar, and I've never seen an aleph like this one. Might the Hebrew on the stone date, then, to pre-exilic times? Could it be the hand, said one, of a proselyte of some long past age, imperfectly instructed in the Hebrew religion? Perhaps the work of a plebeian, an uneducated Hebrew. When I plowed through these accounts, awash in the technicalities of orthographic detail and the arcana of archaeology, my eyes glazed over. But Weyrich's contemporaries couldn't get enough. The press, from the Ohio Farmer and the New York Evangelist to the Ladies' Repository and the Occident and American Jewish Advocate, obliged, filling column after column of newsprint with information about the physical dimensions and cultural import of Weyrich's find. Meanwhile, a steady round of lectures fed the public's appetite for more. Getting to the bottom of what the New York Times called one of the greatest problems that has ever bewildered the American historian had much to do with the attention Weyrich's discovery received. Who built the stone heaps? Who were the earliest inhabitants or aboriginals of the New World? These were questions of long standing. And so Weyrich's discovery was the latest, and for a few months at least, seemingly the most definitive development in a continuously unfolding story that dated to the early years of the Republic, when Americans first looked to the past and to the soil to establish an ancient pedigree. When it came to the identity of the mound builders, speculation had been rife, reported the Washington Star, understating the complexity of the situation. But no more. The Decalogue stone and the site from whence it came, deep within an ancient stone mound, provided a welcome measure of closure. Does this not appear very Jewish? Doesn't it not look very much like the act of Joshua, who wrote upon the stones a copy of the laws of Moses? Does this not furnish us with strong grounds for the belief that our mound builders were Jews? Surmised Isaac Schmucker, a founding father of the town of Newark, Ohio, and like Weyrich, a firm believer in the 10 lost tribes theory of origin. From his perspective, nothing more effectively shored up the antiquity of the United States than the discovery of the 10 Commandments, that age-old covenant between the Jews and their God, nestled within the bosom of a hoary burial mound. But not everyone was convinced. For each American who saluted its authenticity, an equal number of citizens believed the ancient relic to be pure bunk, an artifact of artifice rather than of history, perhaps even a college prank. Allegations of inauthenticity flew fast and furious. These 10 Commandments, charged the dubious-minded, was nothing but an out-and-out scam, a work of religious hocus-pocus. It ranked at the time as one of the 3 most remarkable forgeries in the entire history of archaeology. One witty critic put it even more effectively. Toying with his generation's fondness for taxonomy, he suggested that Weyrich's treasures were best classified as genus bug, species hum. Amid the drumbeat of criticism and what some of Weyrich's champions took to be the relentless maltreating that fell upon his unhappy head, the amateur archaeologist came to regret having recovered the object in the first place. The Hebrew stone, I fear, has done the evil. I wish to God someone else had found it than myself, Weyrich wrote plaintively in 1863 to John Henry, the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and a longtime champion of North American archaeology. Someone, cried Weyrich, someone has been trying to hoax me. The disheartened digger might well have hoped that pointing the finger at a mysterious someone might clear his name, and in the process resolve the matter of the stone's so-called genuineship once and for all. But that was not to be. Left to his own devices, Weyrich put pen to paper, and publishing the results at his own expense, mounted a defense of his actions. Although his text rambles and its prose is dry, opaque, and really hard to follow, there's no mistaking the passion that guided his hand. In painstaking detail, punctuated by a series of woodcuts, he attempted to set the record straight. He wrote, "It took 3 of us working hard from early in the morning to nearly 3 o'clock in the afternoon to reach the clay bed with a sufficient removal of the detritus to effect the examination desired." An equally fine-grained translation of the truncated Hebrew text of the Ten Commandments followed, and on its heels a rhetorical question designed to lay to rest the possibility that David Weyrich, a man of truly humble gifts, was capable of a hoax of this magnitude. Would it not require a very profound scholar in Hebrew to make such an abridgment of the Hebrew Decalogue with foreign characters as is made above, he said? By no stretch of the imagination did the retired surveyor of Licking County fit the bill. For in the end, said he, all the jackknives in Christendom, even in Ohio, couldn't possibly produce such an outrage or a piece of scholarship. The Ten Commandments relic just had to be real. Weyrich's bid for acceptance did little to salvage his reputation. He died a few years later in 1864, his name having become a byword for archaeological chicanery. Some believe that a despairing Weyrich took his own life, others that he had succumbed to the pernicious effects of too much laudanum, which he had taken over the years to alleviate the painful symptoms of a chronic illness. One way or another, the holy stone had done him in, along with the truth. Was this simple-minded, earnest man of the people a dupe? Had his unwavering commitment to the so-called Jewish theory of American history, had it rendered him a pawn in someone else's scheme? A number of contemporaries certainly thought so. We are bound to believe that in this manner he has been and is a victim, and not a victimizer. Harper's Weekly grudgingly conceded in the wake of having harpooned Weyrich and his find. But other equally reputable voices were not so quick to let him off the hook. The discovery in Weyrich's workshop of a Hebrew Bible, as well as a set of chisels, and some say even bits of slate with snippets of Hebrew carving that called to mind a practice exercise. These discoveries led his critics to insist that it was the man from Ohio, and not some other, who had fashioned the Ten Commandments in the first place. What renders Weyrich's putative relic especially fascinating is not so much the various theories that attend its origins or its meaning, but what was not said about it. Near as I can tell, no one batted an eye at its contents. Nary a soul, not even the most hardened of doubting Thomases, wondered why, hoax or no hoax, the biblical passages that had to do with the Ten Commandments, rather than some others, were showcased in the first place. The issue simply didn't come up. It strained no one's credulity, overtaxed no one's imagination, or flummoxed anyone in the least that the text of the Decalogue happened to materialize in Ohio one fine fall day on the eve of the Civil War. At the time, people accepted or questioned the agedness of the stone's patina, the antiquity of its inscriptions, and the skill with which truculent Moses was depicted. but no one had anything what to say about its subject matter. It was almost as if geology had trumped reason, the stoniness of the original biblical Ten Commandments presaging and legitimating the stoniness of this one. Bound together by their sturdy materiality, by their stolidity, these two decalogues, one from the old world and the other from the new, stood for something immutable, elemental, and interconnected, the fullest expression of the imperishable. Then again, it didn't take much for Weyrach's contemporaries to embrace the notion that a pre-exilic version of the Ten Commandments had washed up on their shores. By the time he announced his thrilling discovery, Americans throughout the country had taken the biblical do's and don'ts to heart, rooting them as much in the American psyche as in its landscape. Swept along by the current of enthusiasm for Moses, a lionized American hero whose transformation of a ragtag bunch of folks into a disciplined community bound by law was widely believed to parallel the nation's very own history. The Ten Commandments then were heralded as an American phenomenon through and through. The Decalogue rhapsodized Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, another Ohioan. The Decalogue, he said, was the very first Declaration of Independence, the first proclamation of liberty, the first and eternal blast from the trumpet of freedom. And lest anyone miss the connection between Mount Sinai and America, Rabbi Wise elaborated. Louder and mightier yet resounded that one great and powerful word of the Almighty, which is freedom, freedom, freedom. What American would argue with that, or would want to? If you were determined to establish a national identity, especially one burnished by a distinguished pedigree, there happened to be no better text on which to hang it than the Ten Commandments. In one fell swoop, it assembled the rule of law, the word of God, and the promise of election, joining them together in the vision of an ancient past and the prospect of a glorious future, and all under the banner of indigenousness. The Ten Commandments, you see, just happen to be the perfect foundational document. The second text I'd like to share with you runs to 202 pages and also bears a rather nondescript title. It's called Moses in Egypt, the documentation to the motion picture, The Ten Commandments. Published by the University of Southern California Press in 1956 and festooned with footnotes, this book seems to be a work of scholarship. It's not. Despite its pedigree, Moses in Egypt was the handiwork of Henry Nordlinger, one of Cecil B. DeMille's right-hand men. Under his supervision, thousands of facts were marshaled to establish the credentials of the Ten Commandments, that technicolor blockbuster of post-war America. 10 years in the planning and 5 years in the making, the Ten Commandments gave new meaning to epic, a colossal undertaking from start to finish. The statistically intimidating production was said to have employed 15,000 people at a time, among them hordes of extras, many of them local Egyptians passing as ancient Israelites. The New Yorker, for its part, suggested the production encompassed more living things than the entire population of Moses' Egypt. The film drew on scale, pyrotechnics, and history to comment on and deepen the immense hold that Moses, the Exodus, and the giving of the Ten Commandments had long exerted on American culture. The immensity of the production was sufficient to compel Americans to take a second look. People, beasts, pageantry, scenery, costumes, jewelry, all of this tumble at you as from a cornucopia, exclaimed Father James Fenlon Finley, all a twitter at the 16 sphinxes and towering arches, some reaching as high as 100 feet, that lined the way to Pharaoh's court. Arguably the largest construction project in Egypt since the Suez Canal, the newly fashioned Egyptian city outside of Luxor even boasted its own trio of pyramids. Obviously related a visitor to the set, DeMille was thinking big. And that was just the half of it. The star-studded cast added to the razzle-dazzle. A who's who of stage and screen, it featured Yul Brynner, Vincent Price, Sir Cedric Hartwick, Edward G. Robinson, and Dame Judith Anderson, who, as the doleful Memnet, was the possessor of ominous secrets. Chewing the scenery, the cast also filmed several of its scenes on location, where amidst the vast expanse of the desert and the stony, arid, seemingly immutable landscape, that expression accrued a new meaning. We rolled our cameras from Goshen to the Red Sea, then across the wilderness of Shur, down through the wilderness of Sin, and up the steep, barren, majestic, awe-inspiring slopes of Mount Sinai to the holy ground where Moses stood to receive the law. DeMille animatedly recounted, as if he had personally experienced the exodus from Egypt and stood at Sinai too. Back home on the Paramount lot, the filmmaker and his crew upped the ante by making use of the latest technology, from glowing Technicolor to the singular talents of the studio's special effects department, ensuring that reds were never richer and blues never brighter, simulating the crossing of the Red Sea by means of hydraulic equipment capable of spilling 300,000 gallons of water in 2 minutes flat, sonorizing the voice of God by recording and then slowing down an actor's words until they seemed like vibrations from some other world, heightening a sense of tension and foreboding by making use of the theremin, a spooky, ghostly-sounding electronic instrument, filling the screen with a sickly green vapor that put audiences in mind of radioactivity. All the tricks of the trade were deployed to animate the drama that lay at the heart of the biblical account. Authenticity, the third and arguably the most fascinating element on which the Ten Commandments pivoted, allied scale and technology with history, or more to the point, with the process of transmission. Cutting a vivid swath through Old Testament country, DeMille insisted that every aspect of his film, from its color palette to its sound, be as authentic, as historically true, as rooted in the sources as possible. You are to invent nothing out of your own talented imaginations, he charged his team of screenwriters, prompting one of them to observe that working on this picture was more akin to a detective investigation than the composing of a screenplay. The efforts of DeMille's team to ensure that every single detail was based, as they put it, on actuality, or within probability of actuality, their efforts led them to consult 950 books, 984 periodicals, 1,286 clippings, and 2,964 photographs, filling the pages of the book Moses in Egypt with abundant detail. At first blush, the film's display of bibliographic extravagance paralleled its visual extravagance. The first read as an extension of the second, yet another form of showmanship. On closer reflection, the two made for awfully strange bedfellows. Where feature films are typically an exercise of the imagination, nonfiction books are typically an exercise in scholarship. Fact and fancy don't usually go hand in hand, but DeMille made sure they did, transforming history into a special effect, every bit as dazzling, calculating, and as audience-pleasing as more traditional forms of cinematic wizardry. Under Nordlinger's direction, the film's production team consulted everything: Egyptian wall paintings and biblical illustrations, 19th century ordnance surveys of the Sinai Peninsula, and the latest archaeological discoveries from Qumran. Reading and rereading their Bible, as well as Buber and Freud, Breasted and Kenyon on Moses and the ancient Near East, they looked to these authoritative texts for information, for guidance on how to build the film sets, dress the actors, choreograph their movements, outfit their steeds, cross the Red Sea, and receive the Ten Commandments. No detail was too small or too ethnographic. What kinds of tents did the ancient Israelites inhabit? Answer: those still in practical use among the tent dwellers of Arabia. What kinds of colors did the ancient Israelites fancy? Answer: the tribe of Reuben was partial to red, The followers of Naphtali preferred wine-colored hues, while those who clustered under the banner of Benjamin liked all colors combined. How did Egyptians move? What kinds of musical instruments did they play? Did they eat roast beef or lamb chops or what? You have to wonder whether all this scholarship was merely a promotional tool designed to woo moviegoers at a time when film was fast losing ground to television. Or maybe it was a way to face down critics, so that, as one of their number put it, when wise guys make fun of the ballet in Pharaoh's court, DeMille calmly refers them to an ancient Egyptian mural, which shows every movement to be authentic. There's no question that DeMille and his team of publicists, thinking strategically about how best to promote the film, harnessed history and geography to public relations. Claims that the Ten Commandments brings Sinai to viewers back home, and that when you see the Red Sea, it is the Red Sea, were hard to beat, as was Zucker's sweeping assertion that with the help of Cecil B. DeMille, we were there when the Lord handed Moses the Ten Commandments. It was also the case that DeMille unequivocally believed that his beloved film stayed true to the facts, and that what others might dub an active interpretation was actually a way to fill in the lacunae in the historical record, not mess with them. Then again, America's #1 film producer and director could not afford to get things wrong. Fiddling with the facts was not an option. The stakes were too high. There is, he said, there is no place for the usual fiction in a picture that deals with the interpretations and circumstances from which not one, but 3 of the world's great religions have sprung. DeMille might have added that given the well-publicized advances in biblical archaeology since the interwar years, as well as increasing opportunities to visit the Middle East, American audiences were much better informed about that part of the world than they had ever been. Meanwhile, the eruption of the Suez Canal crisis, which had taken place only a few short weeks before the release of the Ten Commandments, had once again thrust Egypt and Israel into the limelight. In what was an uncanny coincidence, a marvelous accident of timing, at least as far as Hollywood was concerned, the film made its debut against the raw news of modern conflict between Israel and Egypt, a conflict excitedly related the New York Times, a conflict that has its preamble in the book of Exodus. DeMille turned out to have been right. Audiences, for the most part, responded enthusiastically to the film's distinctive mix of history and hokum, of scripture and spectacle. They greeted the film with open arms. The high and the mighty, the lowly and the meek, as well as those not unanimously DeMille-minded, reported the Motion Picture Herald, took to the movie. So well received was the Ten Commandments that within a year of its debut, it had played to an estimated 21.9 million people, grossing over $26 million in revenue. Paramount officials reported one gleeful employee almost run out of zeros when they project its eventual earnings. Some moviegoers found the Ten Commandments an adjunct and a comfort to faith, or so they told the New York Times. Others relished its contribution to the furtherance of so-called community relations values. And still others, especially the members of the Women's League for Conservative Judaism, who bestowed their annual Torah Award on DeMille, delighted in the way it exemplified, as they put it, the richness of the American tradition, how it advanced brotherhood and focused the eyes and ears of the world on mankind's most magnificent moment. Bearing the weight of such high-minded expectations, the Ten Commandments became a singular expression of Americana. The 2 texts we've just encountered couldn't be more different one from the other. The first dated to the eve of the Civil War. The second emerged nearly a century later in response to the Cold War. One was the handiwork of a single individual of decidedly modest means and limited intellectual ambitions. The other, the handiwork of an expansive team of researchers, had the backing of a major corporation and of a man known as Mr. Movies. Still, what unites them is far greater than their respective differences. For one thing, both texts took their cue from history. Weyrich coached his fidelity to history in geological terms. Nordlinger expressed his through documentation. Bound together by the weight of the past, by the long shadow cast by the Ten Commandments, the two compositions reflected the nation's fascination with the biblical text and its ongoing relevance to modern America. For another thing, both were exercises in apologetics. Weyrich's pamphlet was designed to justify his archaeological find and to protect his reputation. Nordlinger's tome was intended to justify the cinematic enterprise of which he was a vital part and to protect DeMille's good name. Then again, the Ten Commandments needed no apology or safeguarding. In the New World, they stood tall and whole, a vibrant, assertive presence, conferring confidence and authority. Their combination of discipline and agency, of responsibility and possibility, held out the very real promise of order and stability. In their formulation of the ties that bound the individual and the community, the Ten Commandments provided the structure in which freedom might flourish. You had God's word on that. Thank you. Happy to take questions, comments, reminiscences about DeMille's 56 film. Anything? Yes, sir.
Well, you told me. Oh, thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I've seen the Ten Commandments a couple times, and what I remember about it that struck me was in the bibliographical richness of the credits,
Yes.
that it listed the philosopher Philo of Alexandria,
Yes.
who I'm a great fan of and have never seen listed in movie credits. So I was kind of thrilled to see the name there.
Yes.
But he lists him as an historian, and I would have listed him as a philosopher, but just to see him up there at all was kind of a thrill. So I add my name to the list of people who are kind of grateful for the movie and your talk about it.
Thank you. I should add that another thing that DeMille added to the list of credits, and imagine this, as the credits are scrolling on down, there's Philo and there's the Holy Scriptures and this, and there's Midrash. And it's like the first time in the history of America that Midrash was put up on the screen, and you had to give DeMille a lot of credit for that, because I think the vast majority of audiences would take a look at that word Midrash and say, what's that, you know? But Midrash apparently played a great deal of cultural weight in DeMille's thinking about the movie. The big mystery for me is, how did he even know about Midrash? Or the Midrash, as it's called. And if anybody has a suggestion, I'm eager to hear how DeMille, who is the son of a Protestant clergyman, and Midrash was not bandied about back then in the 50s as it is today. It's not taught in a comp lit class. So how did he know about it, you know? So, but thank you for that. Yes?
Is there any more information about the stone that was originally, is there any more information about the stone that was originally discovered that made this guy so crazy?
You can actually see the stone for yourself. All you have to do is go to Coshocton, Ohio, small town in Ohio, where there's a museum called the Johnson Humrick House. And on display in the Johnson Humrick House is the stone, as well as a number of other goodies that Weyrich managed to uncover. And what's wonderful about that is that the museum, which is like a local history museum, is not passing judgment on the veracity or the lack of veracity of the object, but instead using it as an opportunity to tell a story about Central Ohio, which I think is a really interesting interpretive strategy. It's also sponsored all manner of symposia about this, and so theories keep on coming about how old it really is. You know, now that we have the latest technological devices to uncover the past, there are all these new theories, speculative theories. But the best thing is that if you actually want to purchase a copy of the stone, you can. The gift shop has one for $57. So you too can have your very own version of the Weyrich stone. So it still exists, yes. Yeah. Oh, come on. Any other questions, comments? Yeah. What?
Who made the word?
Oh, isn't that wonderful? Isn't the don'ts wonderful? Yeah. So a number of years ago, I was teaching at Princeton, and I was teaching a seminar on America and the Ten Commandments, and I was encouraging my students to think visually about the Ten Commandments, and then one of my wonderful students went home to California for break, and she returned with this drawing, which was a family member's rendition of the Ten Commandments. And I'm not sure, he's probably a lot older. Eli, the author, the illustrator, is probably a lot older, and I'm pretty sure would be apt to disavow his collection of doubts. But I just thought it was so marvelous, the idea of the Ten Commandments as an opportunity for storytelling, especially on the part of a kid. And I just thought it was great. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. So the first example not only occurs right before the Civil War, but I think at the peak of the Second Great Awakening. And the second one, of course, in the face of godless communism. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what these examples tell us about the state of religion in
Great
America
question.
at that particular time.
Yeah. So I think the Ten Commandments does a lot of work, what we call cultural work, and it, at times of really profound instability, offers an opportunity to think about the possibility of stability. So I think that it's no coincidence that this is found. I would even say that the signal historical event is more the breakup of the Union than it is any internal religious upheaval. So clearly that was a time of great rupture. And again, post-war is also a time of great dislocation. And so I think the Ten Commandments are very handy. They come into being as a weight, a really wonderful way, a counter-narrative to all that instability. So I think that's part of their promise. I don't know if that makes sense. I think also when you think about the Wyrick stones, they really come on the heels of the discovery of the Mormon treasures. And so there's some very pronounced belief in that, as one of my sources put it, in the fertility of the Midwestern mind, in its belief that the soil is so rich with all of these indigenous forms of religious behavior or religious belief. So I think that also plays a part. I don't know if that's, getting at it, but I think that there's something that's very pleasing about the Ten Commandments. You also have to think about it as something that's increasingly an American rather than a denominational formulation. It's up until recently, it was very widespread in its appeal, and all sorts of different faith communities claim it as their own. So I think it's probably, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong, it's probably one of the few things that Jews and Christians historically have in common. And so it just lends itself to this articulation of sharedness, I think. But good question. Yeah.
I have a question about...
Where's that coming from?
Right.
Oh, there we go.
The last thing you mentioned about Cecil DeMille and Midrash, I don't know if there's any evidence that he actually read this work, but wouldn't Louis Ginsberg's The Legends of the Jews have been the most accessible format for Midrash in English?
Right. I take your point. I'm not sure that he read it, but whoever was helping him think through, or at least credentialize the movie, knew of Midrash and probably knew of Ginsberg. And look, there are lots of clergymen who are visiting the sets. Maybe one of them whispered in his ear that you might want to, or Nordlinger might want to check out this really fabulous source of great tales about Moses and the burning of the bush and the Ten Commandments. But I've never seen anything archivally, and I've gone through the DeMille papers that would uncover his eureka moment. But I think it's sort of in the air among the learned people. Yeah.
Has anyone done an analysis of the screenplay of the movie to identify what portions are Midrashic based?
The question is, has anybody done a detailed textual analysis of the screenplay, which, by the way, you can find in the Library of Congress, which is where I saw it, and try to determine line by line the various layers of allusion and where he gets his sources from. Not that I know, and I'm certainly not equipped to do it, but what's clear to me is that it is a very layered text, and then he draws from all over the place, and that very often he does have his way with the text. He claims very forthrightly that he's not messing, but if you know some of the names in our household, one of the, what's her name? Yochebed. The character of Yocheved, who's, tell me, who was that again? I'm blanking. Moses' wife, birth mother. Something, an important biblical character. She has a beautiful name, Yocheved, and he calls her in the film Yochebel, and we have an aunt, Yocheved, and we always thought it was hilarious that she could also be called Yochebel. Very funny. So he makes up a lot of names, he makes up scenarios. Maybe that's the Midrash calling, I don't know. But he does take liberties with the text, except he's steadfast in insisting that they're not liberties, they're translations. So.
Thank you for your talk. About the stone.
Yes.
The Mormons believe that some of the lost tribes of Israel came to America, USA, America. So I was wondering if that man was just playing along.
I think it's a very good point that the Mormons, lots of folks at this time, so in antebellum America, are thinking about the 10 lost tribes theory. There's a gentleman in New York who's been very widely written about, Mordechai Noah, who is actually an official in New York, who published very actively about the 10 lost tribes. It's one of these ideas that galvanizes the imagination. What's new in this particular case is the notion that the 10 lost tribes actually brought with them the 10 Commandments, or fashioned their own version of the 10 Commandments once they were in America. So that's an interesting wrinkle. But clearly it's in the zeitgeist of the 19th century, especially on the part of people who are very eager to find a very ancient pedigree for this country.
I already spoke once, but your question about the Midrash reminds me that there is a place where I could recognize where Cecil B. DeMille quoted Philo, and because my eyes were very alert to any presence of that philosopher in the movie. And it's at the burning bush scene when Moses, and I think Joshua is actually with Moses at that scene, which is not really biblical, I think. And either Joshua or Moses says about the encounter that you have had an encounter with eternal mind. And I'm sure that's not in the book of Exodus, but eternal mind would be in Philo. And I remember thinking later, as I thought back on the movie, that he really did use that source.
So here's a job for you in your spare time. You can go through the movie and pick out those portions that are from Philo or Midrash or other forms of biblical exegesis, or just straight out of DeMille's imagination. All right. Yes, right here, I think.
Thank you. About the stone, given the fact that it is the 10 Commandments after living out slavery, was any discussion, because it is the time of the Civil War, etc., how this is impacted, especially in Ohio?
Yeah, the questioner asked very smartly, given given the zeitgeist, the larger climate, and the 10 Commandments, was there any discourse at the time about the relationship of this find to slavery? Not at the time, but I would say 20 or 30 years ago, a group of scholars taking another look at the Wyrick stone were advancing the argument that, and I can't do justice to the complexity of the arguments, I'm not even going to try, but they adduced some kind of internal notion that the Wyrick to-do was really all about making it clear that slavery was no good for the nation, and that they were going to then use the 10 Commandments, the stone, as kind of a proof text. That very well may be, I don't know, but there's nothing at the time in all of the sources that that I took a look at that would give rise to that particular theory. But, we historians are really good about predicting the past and coming up with new interpretations, so it may very well be. I don't know. All right. What's really fascinating is that in the 1880s, a very reputable newspaper put forward the suggestion that it was high time in American culture for the Ten Commandments to be aerated and ventilated. I'm not sure that happened in the 1880s, but it happened tonight. So I thank you very much for allowing me to aerate and ventilate the Ten Commandments. Thank you.